Could you explain shortly in layman's terms the difference between centralized XRP and decentralized ADA in terms of what would define one as a security, or is this topic taboo? I mean, it's not taboo. It's the single most important topic in cryptocurrency space. So the problem with cryptocurrencies, they do everything and nothing. And some days they look like securities, some days they look like commodities, some days they look like currency, some days they look like something else entirely. In many ways, cryptocurrencies are the stem cells of finance. So a stem cell is like a supercell, and basically it can become a heart cell or a brain cell or so forth. And regulation's a little difficult because more often than not, regulators like buckets. So they don't see stem cells, they see the heart cells and the brain cells, and then there's regulatory agencies connected to that system. So you have your cardiologist for your heart, you have your neurologist for your brain. Well, what ologist do you hire for your stem cell? And so the problem with cryptocurrencies is that because of that flexibility, at times regulators do get involved when they shouldn't get involved, or they get in ways that are a bit counterproductive. And sometimes that's well-intended, sometimes it's malicious and political. It just depends on the type of regulator. So far, the SEC has had a fairly light hand in the cryptocurrency industry. I think there was well over 1,000 ICOs that were done the last 5 years. They've only enforced a few dozen of them. Those enforcement actions, by and large, haven't been too problematic. A lot of them were obvious Ponzi schemes and scams and so forth. XRP has always been a difficult actor in the cryptocurrency space. And the reason being is, first, they've always differentiated themselves. So, there's Bitcoin and the lines of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin and Litecoin and Bitcoin and Zcash and these things where, that was one model, proof of work in a relatively same code base, and they'd vary on the consensus algorithm of privacy and monetary policy, but they're all kind of there. Then you had like the next generation, like the Ethereum and the Ethereum S. And then you have these third generation ones, and there's much more error between all these systems because they do so much more. But we have common threads. The common thread is decentralized control. So basically, no one actor runs the system in any dimension. And no one actor is entrusted with a key piece of operation of the system, where if that actor was to disappear, the system simply would not work. For example, if the Ethereum Foundation or Blockstream went out of business today, and they all were on the same plane and it crashed in the Andes, Ethereum Bitcoin would still be here. And frankly, Cardano has reached the point where Cardano would still be here. Why? Because the network is run by the SPOs. And it would be very trivial for the SPOs to do a few things in the network to force D to zero and run that fork of the system. And so at this point, Cardano is quite decentralized. And it always was decentralized from the very beginning because we had not one, but several core entities. And as I mentioned, more than a dozen development shops, independent development shops, work on the code for Cardano all across the world. And there's hundreds of thousands of community members. The problem with XRP is that the core company owned all the money and played central bank and decided to use that as a distribution mechanism for business development, amongst other things. Now, on its face, is not necessarily a problem, but combine that with exorbitant executive compensation, where two members of the company got $600 million. Combine that with the consensus algorithm, which is kind of an invitation-only system. Combine that there's not a lot of strong use and utility inside the system, especially amongst the market verticals that they were interested in. For example, I'm in Africa. I've been there for 3 years. We talk more about remittances there than they do. And this is kind of their bread and butter, according to their business logic. These facts and circumstances just simply don't bode well for Ripple, which is why people like, for example, Coin Center, they did a very strong analysis of why Bitcoin is not a security, why is Ethereum not a security, but you'll notice they never did for XRP. There was also a lot of arrogance in that organization for a long time, and I experienced it firsthand. I'd go to events in Silicon Valley, be on a panel, there'd be a Ripple person there, and I just get a lot of attitude from them. And we'd reach out to them and say, hey, we're interested in Interledger at the W3C or something like that. And it never really went anywhere. And so it was just puzzling to me how they never seemed interested in actually innovating and creating utility for their system. For example, they did some things that were actually very sensible. They created a product called Codius, which I thought was really well thought out, but it never went anywhere. And there was no interest in ever decentralizing the consensus protocol so that it would look much more like a consensus protocol that you'd expect in a cryptocurrency setting, like what we've done with Ouroboros, or Vitalik has done with Casper, or Gavin's done with the Polkadot algorithm. So yeah, on the surface, there are tokens. Airline miles are tokens. But when you actually get into the facts and circumstances, Ripple is a very different animal than Cardano or Ethereum or Polkadot. And the game that they played was to ingratiate themselves with governments and large regulated entities and get regulators to just love them. In certain cases, foreign regulators like the FCA or the Japanese FSA, these types of people, and they say, oh yeah, it's great. And then they had this giant war chest of XRP, so they'd give it to a bunch of people and say, okay, be our friend. And that's how they got adoption. And they kind of were like an interbank settlement system to eventually kill SWIFT, amongst other things. The problem is that you just can't live in a dual world where you play central bank and you finance your project through the divestment of $1.3 billion worth of a token, but then you're also equity financed, and you could have used that to do product development. And the people that you're selling that 1.3 billion of XRP to are retail investors. It's not something that the SEC views kindly. And what happens is those facts and circumstances create a strong incentive to create an enforcement action. And everything looks like a nail when you only have a hammer. And so the enforcement action that the SEC can do is simply saying it's a security. Then it gives them the power to actually go and do something. Now, that said, there's a lot more they could have done. They could have pursued what's called a 10b-5 case where they said securities fraud. And when I read the 71-page filing, I was surprised that they didn't go that far, because they really made the case for 10b-5-esque behavior, especially when they were discussing market manipulation and price fixing and these other things, or inaccurate disclosures where there were information asymmetries that existed there. So it's a difficult case all around, especially given that it's very different than what happened with EOS and from a lot of other enforcement actions. With EOS, the SEC had an escape valve where they said, we're going to focus on the ERC20 token that Dan and company sold, and we're going to take a position that that certainly was a security. Okay. And then they fined them for that. But what they didn't do is connect that ERC20 token to EOS in distribution today. So they said, maybe that's a security, maybe it's not a security. Well, we're not going to talk about it. We're not even think about it. Okay, so it basically gave a way for both sides to save face. The SEC got a good enforcement action. They were able to get a $24 million fine. Block One gladly paid that, kind of let those sleeping dogs lie, and then they could move on with their life and start operating their network. The problem with this enforcement action is there's no escape valve. The position the SEC has taken is that XRP was a security in 2012, and it remains a security today, 8 years later. Okay, so what does that effectively mean? It means that all behavior that they did would be subject to securities laws and disclosure, insider trading regulations, all these types of things, and they'll connect those dots accordingly. Now, I've said before, I believe that XRP is not a security, at least in the general sense. And I go back to that stem cell argument. There is certainly security-like behavior, and it's deeply puzzling to me, for example, in the age of smart contracts, why one company would, or an actual real company instead of a smart contract, would be responsible for distribution of a token. That makes no sense. You don't have to do that when you have an already existing functioning network. Okay, so that alone is problematic, especially when there's discretion amongst the custodial company to spend that. I think the Stellar people did a legal analysis on this. I imagine, I'm speculating that they did, because they chose to burn a lot of their currency. And in the context of what happened with Ripple, actually makes a lot of sense, because maybe they after running the calculation, realized that that central bank function is very problematic for the network. So there are clearly differences here. Now, I don't believe for a moment that, for example, if Ripple goes down and XRP burns down in fire, that somehow the whole industry is going to fall apart and everything is going to be a security, Ethereum and on down. It's just not going to happen. I don't believe that at all. I think, frankly, the big fight that's going to happen in 2021 is going to be the proof of stake fight. Does proof of stake make a cryptocurrency a security or not? It is my belief the answer is no. However, this has never been litigated, much like proof of burn has never been litigated as a distribution mechanism. It's one of those open questions in the cryptocurrency space. And Ethereum 2 is going to force that conversation, much like Libra forced the conversation for stable coins and brought them into the forefront. So what's going to happen with XRP is if they win, the Ripple people win, it would probably make it much more difficult to just blanket call a cryptocurrency a security. So it would strengthen the argument that proof of stake does not make your instrument a security, because it would create a test that respects decentralization in addition to the other three pillars of the Howey test. If they lose, this doesn't automatically mean that everybody else gets hurt and they all got lumped together. But what it does do is say that the SEC is going to look at conduct as much as they do form and function. And if conduct is bad, then they'll push the needle a bit on form and function to make you a security, to regulate you accordingly, so they have the ability to pursue enforcement. So that is problematic for the industry, because there's a lot of things here. And the problem is that the investor gets hurt principally. Ripple's down over 40%. It just amazes me the level of emotional maturity of some of the people in this space, where they're dancing on the grave of Ripple. It's not even dead. And at the end of the day, the vast majority of people at the moment who hold XRP are cryptocurrency people, and there's nothing wrong with them. They're perfectly reasonable, legitimate people. And they just lost nearly half of their net wealth because of a regulatory event. And they're not going to get any recourse at all. There's no, you can say right of rescission or all these other things. No one is going to cover that massive market cap loss. So there's just been enormous wealth destruction as a consequence of an event. And so the very people that are professed to be protected from this event are the ones who will be hurt the most from this event. That does not excuse principals taking $600 million. It just doesn't, especially for a central bank function. It's one thing if you get lucky and you get a windfall. You enter into a strategic partnership, let's say with a mining service. You mine thousands and thousands of Bitcoins in the early days, like 2010, 2011, and then you divest those. Or you're like Charlie Lee and you mined a lot of Litecoin and you divest it. You got lucky. Congratulations. There you go. But Ripple was different in that they gave to themselves a central bank function, and they monetized their company through a central bank function. So that was intended for the growth and development of the ecosystem first. And should that succeed, then you can, of course, have a windfall later. And they had the opportunity to have that windfall through equity financing, through venture capitalists in California. Instead, they chose just to sell the token on people. So it's not pretty. It's not clean. I'm not a big fan of that conduct. And I think it just is bad for the industry as a whole. And there's a reason why Ripple has a bad reputation in certain circles, and people don't view them as a normal cryptocurrency, and why Vitalik says what he says and so forth. That said, I think we as an industry need to start working together, because if we're divided, it's going to be very easy for us to be picked apart project by project and burned to the ground. So it makes a lot more sense for us to decide common threads that we have. And the Howey test is overly broad. It doesn't work well in a functional regulation sense, especially when you have these financial stem cells. It's not a global thing, and it creates a lot of weirdo inconsistencies in the law. It is in everyone's best interest for that to be updated and modernized to meet our needs. So we should work together on that. It's also in everyone's best interest for us to get past this proof of stake open question, not just from the regulation viewpoint, but also the taxation viewpoint, because U.S. taxation is crazy with proof of stake at the moment. and it makes no sense. It needs to be changed. So, of course, for my part, I'll work very hard at trying to work with other people where it makes sense to create common knowledge, common threads, common standards. And we've had miracles of success in Wyoming, including the election of a U.S. senator who's very pro-crypto. So we're making progress. We really are. By no means doubt that. And also changes are going to happen in the U.S. Treasury Department. Mnuchin is a scumbag, and he clearly hates our industry and clearly wants to destroy it. He's going to be gone here in less than 30 days. And his successor will probably be at least reasonable enough to have a conversation with. And that's all we ask as an industry.